Okay. Right. Okay. Readjust the zoom and everything. Okay, so we had our camera mysteriously fail at the last minute. So I'm Kyle Cordes at Oasis Digital. Welcome to the St. Louis Angular Lunch. Today we have Matt Follett talking about browser-based testing. And I think he was just saying before we started he's about to disappoint us all with his choice of tools. But that's okay, because I specifically asked him if he would please come tell us about this topic, not necessarily from the point of view of Angular and tools, but just from the point of view of having been down this road and suffered extensively doing automated browser testing at scale. So take it away, Matt.
Thank you. Yep. As he said, my name's Matt Follett. I'm currently a senior software engineer at Observable Networks. Everything else about that slide is very not interesting. The important part to think about is I felt this pain. I've been doing Selenium tests for a while now. You know, what you end up doing is you write 4 lines to try and find an element. It doesn't find the element. You think the selector looks fine, so you try it in a browser, and that looks fine. So you add a wait, and then you pull up DevTools really fast, but that doesn't work. So then you put a longer wait, and you finally figure out, oh, you thought the ID was camel case, but it's snake case, and you just didn't notice that, because in your mind you map those things the same. Fix the test, you write 4 more lines, fails again. Put a really long sleep in, curse Selenium, curse Selenium's authors, find the issue and fix it. But of course you put that long sleep in there, which meant that when you tried to kill things, it actually kept connection to the database because it kept part of the server around. So you just start killing things because something's got to die. Start daydreaming about living a technology-free life in a cabin by a lake. But you remember you like Reddit, and so you keep going. Push it to the server, fails again. Change isn't in the database, so you just put sleeps everywhere. Somewhere there is a problem, so let's just put sleeps everywhere. Push it. Works, it's the next guy's problem. Pack up, go to a bar. Things can be better. First thing, and this is an important one, my little example there actually does not fit under this, but the first question you have to ask yourself, do you actually need to be using Selenium for the thing you're doing right now? And there's a really easy way to know that. You have to ask yourself, is this actually being driven by user input? Is it modifying the state on the server? Are you caring about what the server comes back with? And are you caring about how the user perceives the thing that comes back? If the answer to all those is not yes, if all you're worried about is dealing with the user input, well, that's easy. That's a front-end testing framework. You should just be using Jasmine and not be using Protractor or some Selenium-based thing. If you're only caring about what's happening in the back end, then you certainly shouldn't be using Selenium because it actually won't even work that well. Again, if you're only caring about how your client responds with or responds to the server's response, that's not Selenium either. The only case that you really need to be using Selenium is if you're actually worried about the user putting something in, it getting sent back to the server, it coming back from the server, and then it doing something. If that's not the full path that you're testing, then don't be doing this because you're just making you're making your life harder. And in general, fewer Selenium tests, less pain. You know what? I am actually using the wrong slide deck. This was for a previous one. So let's pull this one up. I should have, but this is not, sadly. See, and you would know this because I changed, or I should have known this because I changed the, I made these dark and sad. But I also added, I do believe, this brief note. So one thing that's important about this talk is that we're not talking about Protractor, we're not talking about Capybara, we're not talking about Selenium technically. What we're really talking about is just the process of doing these things. It doesn't matter which one of these you're using. Pretty much all of these are going to be wrapping something that's either like WebDriver or WebDriver-esque, and all of these practices apply across all those places. So, so I'm not going to say I actually on occasion might say in Protractor you do X, but that's only a concrete example of the general things that I'm talking about. So I'm not saying you should use Protractor. I'm not saying you shouldn't use Protractor, though I have my opinions on that. One thing I would say is that if you want to debate me on any of my opinions, I am open for that, but not during the talk because we actually only have 37 minutes left at this point, and I'd like to have time for questions. If you have a question, absolutely interrupt me. See how dark and sad these are? It's much better this way. Oh my gosh, I talk so much. So anyway, things can be better. Do you really need these things? But if you actually have to do it, remember a couple of things about Selenium. Every test you write, it costs time. It costs time for you to write it. It costs time to maintain it. It actually literally costs your company money if you're using something like Sauce Labs because you're paying them for the amount of time that you're running the tests. So the more tests you write, problem that is, and there are reasons for this. Selenium tests are slow. They have to be slow. Like by definition, they're slow tests because they're starting at the browser, they're ending up in a database, and then they're coming all the way back around again. And they're doing a bunch of things. And they can be very fragile against race conditions. Sometimes that's unavoidable. Sometimes it's avoidable. And starting up, like if you just need to run one Selenium test or something like that, that is a really long process to start up because you're starting up a web server, you're probably creating a database, you're running through a whole bunch of migrations. Like it's a single Selenium test has a lot of cost to it. And so one thing that you really have to remember about this is that Selenium tests aren't like unit tests, and you shouldn't treat them like unit tests. You're not supposed to look at them as, I want to test like a specific single thing on my page. You want to test like whole user paths. You want to say, all right, what happens when a user fills out the enrollment page but screws up half the fields? Or what happens when the user fills out the enrollment page but doesn't mess anything up? Like those are the things that you want to be testing, or go through the actual steps that your user's doing to perform some task. That's what these tests are actually supposed to be for. If you're testing anything smaller than that, you're not really getting the value out of it. And one of the nice things about testing these long paths is that all that value of like testing all these different conditions that the user might be perceiving kind of amortizes across, helps amortize the cost of having all that startup problems and all the different little things that come with any given singular Selenium test. But I call this "don't have to suck." I probably should have said "doesn't have to suck" as much. A lot of the problems you're going to have, they're going to exist. One quick thing that you can do, and Protractor has this, so congratulations if you're using Protractor. I don't actually know of another framework that has this, but they're really easy to write, is if you don't have one available from your framework, write yourself a REPL for this, something that you can start up and it'll bring up a Chrome instance or whatever browser you want to use, and it'll actually allow you to execute commands against Selenium to drive that page. That is a huge savings for writing Selenium tests, because instead of going through the process of writing 4 lines and then seeing if it worked, and then writing 4 lines and running through the whole test again to see if it worked, you can actually write it like one line at a time. Find button by text submit and see if that works. Oh, you get about a half-second turnaround. It found it. Okay, now click that. Okay, and now you can keep going from that. So you actually get the rapid development that you're used to in other cases. Yes? Go for it.
Have you played with Elementor, which is like a code tool or protractor that sounds similar to this, but it's like finding elements inside the browser is hard, and therefore it's hard to write tests around them. So we built this tool that lets that become really easy. I haven't played with it ever perfect.
No, I haven't. No, I'd be curious about that one. Oh, yeah. The question was, have I played with Elementor? And I have not played with Elementor.
Supposedly stands for Element Explorer, which is
Apparently it stands for Element Explorer. This parroting thing is going to be interesting, I think. There's a bonus. Some libraries, interestingly enough, Protractor or Capybara, if you happen to get it Poltergeist working, which I never did, and I don't know anybody who has. But if you get this thing working, you can actually set the debugger in, you can start a debugger inside of a test. So you can say, if this fails, pop up the debugger, and then I can actually explore the state of my application at that point, or the state of my web interface at that point. And then you can actually go and start looking as to why is it that it failed? Was it a false assumption? Was the test actually finding something wrong, or was it that I, dorked a locator?
Not that it means much to this audience, really, but pry for Ruby, you can just do binding.pry anywhere, and you can do that in the catch.
Yeah. So
Fail test.
that's a good point. If your language supports some sort of like drop me into a REPL, you can actually just use that. You won't necessarily get a REPL, and then you won't necessarily get, like, if you're in a headless mode, you won't get pushed into a headed mode or something like that. But if you're already running it in Chrome or something like that, you can drop into a REPL, and then that'll pause the test, and you can do whatever you want. That's a very good point. But one of the things I mentioned is that writing browser tests, they're often very fragile to change. There are a couple of things that you can do to try and mitigate that issue. A lot of your fragility is going to come from finding elements. This logic can change a lot because the page is going to change a lot, and when the page changes, that's going to change how you find things on that page. There are two ways that you can solve this. One is you can make that code, you can extract that code out, try and make it very easy to find, easy to change, easy to have as few side effects in changing that as you want. And you can also try and just make sure that you're using the best selectors. If you have locators, which it's really kind of weird that locators is the term that's used, then you should absolutely be using those. The actual Selenium library has them. Python Selenium library has them. Protractor has them. Dub Selenium and Perl, which I don't think anybody in this room is using, has them, but they're kind of weird.
What is a locator?
I will get to that right now. A locator is actually really nice. Here's an example of a locator in CSS, or in Protractor, is instead of saying like, a lot of times you'll say, click on the element that has this button text or something like that. What you can say instead is you can actually just make a locator that's just singularly the how I find this thing. And if you take these and you put them at the top of the class that you're building, the top of the file that you're working on, they're easier to find, they're easier to modify. You're keeping this in one spot, so you're not having to change it everywhere when you change the page. And even if your specific framework doesn't explicitly have locators, it's really easy to make something that's a lot like a locator. The what? Is it really just, say that one more time. Oh yeah, there should be a return.
Okay.
Yeah. It's this code is not necessarily correct. It's an example. There should be a return, but if I put a return there, that would have been too long. Style. Say what? But then correct. Whatever. Benefits of this is that, like I said, it's easier to find these than it is to find all the little places that you've done something. You put it in one spot. You don't have to change it everywhere. It's much more dry. It's separating the how versus the what you're doing, like how you find it versus what you're actually doing with it. The next thing is you want to use good selectors. What the internet tends to agree with is that the best selector to use is an ID. Then you kind of go down the list all the way down to XPath. God help you at that point. I actually don't agree with this, and I think by ID when you're doing Angular stuff is actually really dangerous because you really shouldn't be using a lot of IDs in your directives, because anything that you can have multiple times on a page shouldn't have an ID attached to it. So ID very quickly falls off. My preference is, the other thing I don't like about IDs is the user doesn't know what the ID of any of your elements are. The user doesn't know the name of any of your elements. The user doesn't know the class of any of your elements. So if you say, ID foo has this value, or click the button with ID foo, that's like not helpful. Because if the if the text of that button isn't submit, then or something that indicates what the button's doing, then the user's not going to click it when they actually get there. I really don't like. My big preference is actually this. If you can, go with the text. Because if you can use the text, like that's what the user's actually seeing, that's what they're actually going to interact with. Some frameworks actually make it really easy to use labels for form or labels for fields on a form. If your framework does do that, then use that functionality. With the caveat that if that framework is Capybara, it's a little inconsistent in how often it works. But it is always, that one's actually always consistent that if it worked the first time, it will work again. It just might not work the first time. Excuse me. So my preference is use text if possible. And then honestly, like name, class ID, those all fall under CSS selectors anyway. Like just use CSS selectors because they're going to be what you actually you could use CSS selectors for partial text also because you could use contains. But my biggest preference is text. Also, text doesn't actually change that much on a page. Like it really is hard to get people to agree on how you should change the lingo that you're using to prompt a user. Like people argue about that really vociferously. So it's easy to trust that that's not going to change. And for the love of God, don't use XPath. If you have a lot of familiarity with XPath, then and you need it, then go ahead. But the problem is that if you don't, or you're wrong with your thought that you have a lot of familiarity, it's going to work great until somebody changes the page in a way that you didn't know about and your XPath didn't handle properly, and now you're falsely selecting something else altogether. Avoid XPath. Just don't use it. Plus, frankly, like you can probably get away with CSS selectors anyway. Page objects. This is another way. This is like the best way to manage dealing with the fact that pages change. If you're not using page objects and you walk out of here, the one thing you need to walk out of here with is to start using page objects. What you're actually doing is you're defining a class that actually defines how you interact with the page. So in your tests, you are no longer saying, find this ID, click on this thing, find this thing, check the value. What you're actually doing is you're using this page object to say, fill out my form, or click the submit button, whatever it is, that sort of thing. And what that means is that all of your tests that are interacting with this page, now they're interacting with this page object, and now when you change the page, you only change the page object. You don't have to change all those tests. Huge win. It does not, you're not supposed to be doing any sort of assertions with page objects, but it allows you to put all of your selectors in the page, all of the interaction with the page, all the workflows you might use. Like you'll eventually want to get to the level where you have on your page objects the, fill out my whole form. I'm going to give you a hash of key value pairs, and you're going to find all the value, all the inputs and fill them all out properly. And I don't even have to worry about that anymore. The traditional definition of a page object is that when you're transitioning between pages, the page object actually returns the new page that you're transitioning to. That's probably a good idea. I've seen that violated without any pain or consequences, but either way. This is a really tight example of a page object, which almost certainly has errors in it. So don't copy and paste this into your code. But basically the idea is like we've defined all of our selectors up top. So now we have an easy selector for like first name input, last name input, username input, password input. Tiny thing, side note about Protractor is that Protractor is actually lazy about these things. So we're defining these here, but it's not actually finding them on the page, which is good because we're defining them in a class before we even got to the thing. So or we're defining it in this function, but you can in this function before we even get to it. But you can safely in Protractor like create use a locator on a thing that doesn't exist, and it won't try and see if it exists until you actually try and use it to locate something. But then we have functionality in here. So we say like populate form is this thing that's just going to go through and set all the fields properly. I had a whole bunch more examples, but I had to delete them all because they wouldn't fit on this slide. But you get the idea. Is this one page object deals with the registration page. It deals with all the interaction with the registration page. It deals with knowing where everything on the registration page is. In fact, it actually even deals with like going to the registration page. You create a registration page and you say, get it, and it'll go to that page. I always named my methods go to. I don't know why I named it get in this case, but you get the idea. That actually is violating the page object pattern technically, because it's not like you wouldn't be getting the page and then going to it. You would be already at the page because something would have returned that for you. It's also an important thing to note that the page object pattern is actually kind of interesting in that it doesn't have to be a page. I very frequently use this pattern for like just complex elements on a page. So your page object pattern can actually, or your page object can consist of a whole bunch of like basically directive objects or something like that are actually managing the complex manipulations of inputs and user interactions on little aspects of the page. And that simplifies that. So now when you change a directive, you change the test, the object that represents that directive in your tests, and you don't have to change it everywhere, you just change it in that one spot, which is really useful in Angular because that directive could appear on a whole bunch of different pages and you don't have to go through and change all the corresponding page objects for that. So while the pattern is called page object pattern, I actually use it for lots and lots of things. And of course, this doesn't apply to Angular. You could be doing with Brick or Ember or Polymer, but I have no idea why you would do that. Another thing that seems to be a common pattern, and actually some communities are a real fan of this, and I kind of loathe it, is there are some aspects of UI design that just frankly make testing easier and make usability easier. Don't lie to your users and say something was done before you even started it. Because when you do that, your Selenium test is going to know. Like, your user might not ever figure it out, but your Selenium test will about 30% of the time, and that's the random failures you're getting on your continuous integration server. So don't tell a user a task was done until it was done, because if you tell it beforehand, Selenium will believe you, and then it'll call you out on it when it goes to check the database if your test is actually doing that, to make sure that the thing actually saved, or when it brings up another page or something. And also loading indicators. Like, they're great for users because then the user knows something's going on, and they're great for your Selenium tests because you can hang weights off of those weights, or off of those indicators. So you can say like, okay, wait for this loading indicator to pop up. Now I can, within that context, extend the amount of time that I'm willing to wait because I know something's going on. Then I can get out of that loading. Once that loading indicator goes away, I can set my wait back down to a much more reasonable time and kind of go from there. You have to be a little bit careful with that, because if you're using a smart loading indicator that like waits a little bit and then doesn't show up if it happened really fast, then you've got to be like conditional with your weights and that sort of thing. So that logic gets a little bit more complicated, but I really recommend these things. I think not lying to your users and letting them know what you're doing is generally a good thing, and it turns out it's helpful in testing. So let's say you're actually pretty happy with your tests and things are going well. Let's talk about actually cross-browser testing and using a service. First off, you're probably not going to set up your own Selenium grid, but you're probably going to use a service that exists for it. Your options are Browser Stack, Sauce Labs, Testing Bot, a bunch of other ones that I've forgotten while I'm standing here. They all suck. They're all really bad. I mean, they're great for what they're doing, but they're all slow. They're all going to be very slow. And by very slow, I mean like whatever your CI server runs your tests at, multiply that by an order of magnitude, and that's a rough approximation of what it's going to take. And to some extent, that's not their fault. There's a whole internet in between you and them. But they're also running on like the cheapest VMs they can get out of Amazon. So that's, some of it is their fault. Some of it's the internet. Some of it's they're they're saving money, which, you know, it's a company. I can't blame them for that. It's a business model. Yeah. But when you're looking into these, there are a couple of like creature. Can't think of the term. A couple of features that you certainly want to have that not all of them provide. If you can get videos, like I know Sauce Labs does videos. I think Browser Stack and Testing Bot do. If you can get videos of the things, that's actually really nice, because when it fails, and it will, you can actually go back and play through the video and see what happened. The alternative to that is most of them will give you snapshots. But the snapshot is just the point where it failed. And plenty of times, the snapshot is of a page that actually didn't load, or you know, a page that you didn't even expect to be at. And so how you ended up there is actually really important. It would have been nice if you had a video. Or in some cases, you haven't been cross-browser testing before, and now you're actually testing on a old version of IE that you claimed you were supporting, and the page is so incredibly broken you don't know what you're looking at anyway. They also provide logs, but the logs are generally useless. So if you have to rely on the logs, good luck with that. I have no advice for you, except don't rely on the logs. Find some screenshots or some video. Once you go onto one of these services, your tests are going to fail. And it's going to be because you're not expecting how slow these tests are going to run. So you need to prepare for this. And there's a couple of ways. In the past, the way that I have prepared for this is I just accepted it and then had the headache of trying to figure out how a test could have failed by either watching the video or just like playing it through my mind is like, okay, why would it have failed there? What would have had to have been slow for that? What would have had to have not responded correctly? There's actually a much better way to do this, which is that you can actually just use a proxy server for this. If you use, I actually say Charles Proxy here is Mac only. That is untrue. Charles Proxy runs on everything. It's actually just a Java app, but I didn't realize that, so sorry. But you can actually set up a proxy in between the client and your actual server and just enforce slowness there. You can also, because Selenium is a WebDriver uses the WebDriver wire protocol, I think. It's something like that. And that is an HTTP protocol also. So if you want to be really mean to yourself, but preparing for these things, you can put a proxy in between both your client and your server and your tests and your Selenium instance, and then slow them down. And so you'll actually recreate the conditions that you'll experience on one of these services, except in the comfort of your own home, and you can actually watch it and see why it's failing. That is like super useful. I highly recommend that. Charles Proxy, if you haven't looked at it, it's got a nice GUI. If you're not comfortable with command line stuff, then I would recommend that one. Browser Mob is harder to use if you're not familiar with like doing stuff by the command line and that sort of thing. And also I think the docs are not really as much there, but you can use that. I would recommend going with whichever one you want. Obviously, if you're going to try and automate this process, which is kind of an interesting idea, you would want to use Browser Mob. And there are probably others. Those are two good examples. So if you're actually going to go through the process, I mentioned a couple of these. The ones I'd recommend considering, Testing Bot is like really cheap, but my experience has been that it's not nearly as polished. But like I said, it's really cheap. And so if you can get over the fact that the docs are not quite as nice as other ones, then you'll get by just fine. Sauce Labs is the pricier alternative. It's honestly not any faster. I really hoped that one of them would compete in that space, but neither seem to. The docs are better, but to be honest, like if you read the docs on Sauce Labs and then go and do stuff on Testing Bot, that probably works fine, but I'm probably going to get hated for having said that. Because, yeah.
So you're talking about the slowness problem?
Yeah.
And the proxies?
Yeah.
To try to simulate it?
Yeah.
So I've seen slowness where a test fails, and I can't tell if it timed out because it broke, or because like it just hadn't finished yet.
Yeah.
And so you keep turning up your knob of how long you're willing to wait.
Yeah.
And so then you're paying one of these companies a lot of money.
Yeah.
But you still don't know if it's broken.
Yeah.
Or if it just hasn't finished yet.
Right.
Any thoughts on that?
So if you go with the proxy thing, you can actually basically just simulate that whole process there. And so that's one approach. It really gets down to you have to sit down and either simulate it locally, or you just have to like think long and hard about it. But yeah, it really kills me to think that the solution to these slow services is to use more time, which is what you're paying for. Yeah, it's a great business model. I think I'm in the wrong business, but yeah, no, I don't have a better answer than that. The third option I'd recommend looking at, by the way, is Browser Stack. They actually have an interesting pricing model. It's a lot nicer, but the weird thing is that they separate the cost of automated tests versus manual tests, and you certainly want to have manual tests. If you run into a case where you're like, oh, this is failing, and it's failing on like IE9, and I don't know if it's failing on IE9 because it's actually a legitimate issue, or because it's an issue with the test, or it's an issue with the service, then at the very least, if you're using a service that provides you the ability to manually test it, you can bring it up on that on a VM that they'll provide you, and you can run through the test manually and see what happens. Because that's often the extra variable in there is like, oh, it failed on IE9. Was it really IE9, or was it Sauce Labs, or was it me, or was it, yeah. So you just kind of have to start eliminating those variables. Having the ability to bring up a VM and manually test things, which Sauce Labs gives you for free and Testing Bot recently started giving you for free, is really nice. Browser Stack gives it to you, and if you add the prices together, it's actually still a very reasonable price, but then you got to get your boss to agree to pay for two things instead of one thing, and I don't know what your business organization is like, so that might be a problem. Cool. Any questions? Because we're at about 12:50, so I figured I'd give myself 10 minutes to defend my state on anything that anybody disagreed with through questions implying disagreement.
And more of a statement that just kind of goes along with your Sauce Lab stuff.
Yeah.
And this is from your prior experience, but like if you're testing IE9 on certain competitor, we'll say, because I don't want to, I guess, rat them out, but like their instance was running on 256 megs of RAM. So we were actually hitting cases where Windows was killing IE because it was running out of memory, which was killing our test. And then they didn't shut down the VM, so we were still getting billed for those minutes. So, yeah, I mean, just kind of to reinforce Matt's comment,
Yeah.
pay attention to them.
Yeah. So yeah, well, what he was saying was that some of these services aren't even running Windows on VMs that meet the required resources available for the version of Windows that it's running, and that within itself can cause problems. And yeah, the vigilance is the best answer to that. There's not a better one. Cool. Any other questions? Or yep.
So I suppose some people might choose to focus more on unit test or component level test.
Mhm.
You do a bunch of things with Karma.
Yep.
They might even go to an extreme to avoid this sort of pain that you've talked about, and only do that. It doesn't seem good. It seems like you want to have some end-to-end tests in addition to those.
Yep.
But finding a balance there, I guess, is an interesting thing to shoot for. In your UI testing, were you doing a lot of that kind of testing in addition to this?
Yeah. So my rule of thumb, and I'm not going to take any questions from my old team for the remainder of this, just in case they imply otherwise. But my rule of thumb was that if we were implementing a feature, it had to have at least one feature test around it, or it wasn't a rule of thumb I had until later on. So there might be some cases where it's not the case, but you you certainly want to have at least one feature test. You probably want to have a few that cover like the weird different cases that a user is going to go through in this whole thing. But what you want is at least one of those, and then you want a whole lot of unit testing around that to verify all the other cases, because it's not the case that you need to test like every possible variation of how a directive is going to manage things. What you're really testing with this is how the user is going to use it and how they're going to like go through this thing. So it should be kind of like a pyramid type thing. Like the number of acceptance tests, user acceptance tests you have are Selenium tests you have should be a lot smaller than the number of unit tests that you have. But you should certainly still have Selenium tests. Like if you don't have those, then the only person that's actually testing that all your things go together is your user. And the thing that's bad about, like the thing that's the worst about that is that this is the one thing, like failing to properly test your UI is the one case where you guarantee that the user is going to catch it, because that's what the U stands for. You can have tests, you can have failures in a lot of points of your system that a user may never notice, but they'll notice when the UI is broken, and they'll probably trust your team less for that than they should for things that are probably like more concerning. Nope, I sorry, violate my rule.
This doesn't have to do with that.
Okay, what's up?
So I had two quick questions that kind of go together. I know Sauce Lab supports this. I don't know if the others do, but you can run perma tests in like those browsers.
Yes.
Like on IE, I weren't getting experience with that, and also like mobile, like tablet stuff. You have experience there.
So yeah, that's a good point. Sauce Labs does support running your unit tests in different browsers, so you can make sure that your unit tests actually pass in all the crazy browsers that you support, which is actually really helpful. I think that there is a way to get those to work in other ones, but I cannot. I have not personally done it yet. And then most all of these support some amount of mobile, but the mobile minutes are always kind of funny because, like, excuse me, if you're doing mobile development, like if you're testing for iOS, that means you're on a Mac, which means that they're probably billing you differently than they're going to bill you for everything else. Plus, they can. Because that's a really popular thing to be testing right now. So yeah, all of these support, like all the three that I mentioned as ones I recommend, all support mobile testing, but they count those as like different minutes, I think, for the most part. I could be wrong. I don't honestly remember.
But the same like caveats.
Yeah. More caveats, probably more. Anything else?
I've got two questions.
Okay.
I'll try to ask them both. You can answer them both. First is just how painful is it to set up your own grid if you get tired of dealing with the delays and costs of the providers? And then the second is the providers give you this huge puke of a list of browsers and versions.
Yep.
If you're trying to support just like most common browsers, how many different scenarios should you be testing against? Like 3, or like an old and a new on the top 5 for a total of 10?
Yeah.
Or like every combination for a total of 175?
Yeah. So first question, how hard is it to set up your own Selenium grid? I've never actually done it, so that is the caveat here. I've always just kind of paid somebody else to handle that. But I would suspect that the hardest part of it, if you're planning to do that, I'm assuming you're of a size where you have somebody already managing operations type stuff, systems type stuff, in which case it shouldn't be any harder for them to have a Windows 9 VM for that than a Windows 9 VM for something else, I think. But the trick, like the thing that actually is more daunting in my mind than managing that sort of thing is trying to find a Windows XP license to be able to test on that, or find a Windows 9, like finding licenses that you aren't able to just casually come across anymore. Would be the part that is the hard part for getting up to speed on that. The second question is, what kind of strategy do you use for determining what browsers and operating systems you want to go with? Frankly, I'm not saying this is a good idea, but my general take on IE on testing against IE was I would always just go with the latest version of Windows that supported that particular IE, and then because I trust IE less than I trust other browsers, I would say that if we said we supported a version of IE, we had tests running on that version of IE. For Chrome and Firefox, I trust them more, so it was a reasonably recent version of Chrome or Firefox. And I think if you're using one of these where they charge you different for Mac minutes versus Windows minutes, then you throw the Mac or the Windows or the Mac minutes at either Chrome or Firefox and trust that it's probably about the same.
Do you test on Safari?
I have never worked someplace that officially supported Safari. No, that's not true. I now work at a place that officially supports Safari. But no, not yet. But that actually, like, Safari has some crazy weird bugs. So you should probably do that. Yeah. Yep.
And a critical customer person uses Safari.
Oof. Yeah. Now, I would argue that if you, like, I always advocate for having an explicit list of these are the browsers that we support, like a policy around it. So we support the N latest versions of IE, we support the N latest versions of Chrome, which realistically, like, that's an overly zealous policy, but I think it's a good one to have. And then those are what you test against. Except, again, I trust Chrome and Firefox to not be crazy, so I don't necessarily test against all of them, because that's a lot of money. Any other questions? Cool. Well, thanks. And it is 12:59, so awesome.
Timing.